welcome to The Missing Middle. I'm Cara Stern.
And I'm Mike Moffatt.
Mike, you used to give advice to Liberal leader Justin Trudeau. When was that?
So that was 2013 to 2015. I was one of his economic advisors, advising on all number of things. And despite my advice, he managed to get himself elected.
And what kind of things did he go to you for?
Well, I mean, originally a lot of it was, the kind of regional economic development policy, a lot of manufacturing policy and things like that. But, over time, this progresses. So, I ended up doing some of the work on the child benefit system, which, to be honest, wasn't something I was too familiar with when I got involved in it. But it ended up probably being one of the most transformative things I've ever done. And, now it's just like completely downhill from here. I peaked too soon, but that's quite all right. It was eye-opening, for a career academic to actually, get my hands dirty and be able to do real public policy was so much fun.
And today we have a guest, Sean Speer. He used to advise former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, and he's now the editor-at-large of The Hub, a center-right online news organization. So welcome, Sean. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks to both of you. Thanks for having me.
So, the first question to you would be the same thing as, what did you advise Prime Minister Harper?
Well, so I joined the Prime Minister's office in the midst of the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009. I started as a junior member of the policy team, and over time took on different roles and responsibilities. I think the main files for which I was responsible and would be of interest to listeners and viewers is successive federal budgets. So I was the PMO lead on budgets beginning in 2010 through to 2013. And in addition to that, like Mike, I also spent some time working on party platforms. So I was the principal lead on the 2011 Conservative Party platform and involved in the 2015 one, which Mike's advice turns out was better. So mostly economic and fiscal policy, but as Mike says, oftentimes, it's a relatively small number of people involved in these types of things, and it tends to be kind of all hands on deck. So I touched on a lot of things, perhaps most importantly, hockey. I was, I think, one of the first people to read Mr. Harper's book, or at least drafts of the manuscript on the origins of the modern day Toronto Maple Leafs, and that's probably, in his view, one of the most important things I did during my time in his office.
That's so fun. I want to bring up in a recent article on The Hub, you talk about the fact nowadays that many Canadians just aren't feeling hopeful about the economy or the country in general. And I just want to read a portion to kind of set up the conversation. The most profound of Trudeau's policy failures is Canada's declining GDP per capita. The country's living standards have effectively fallen for 6 consecutive years for just the third time in more than 60 years. The future doesn't look much brighter either. Long-run projections anticipate that they'll remain stagnant in the coming decades. As economists David Williams and Jacques Finlayson recently wrote, young and aspirational Canadians face 40 years of stagnant average real incomes. The only way to feel confident about future living standards is to avoid looking at the data. So I guess the first thing I want to ask about that is, big question, but how did we get here?
Well, it is a big question. Canada's had well-documented productivity challenges for a long time, and those seem to have started to manifest themselves in a most profound way in recent years, with this drop in GDP per capita, which is typically one of the better measures for understanding and comparing living standards across different jurisdictions. It's obviously a multifaceted problem. Everything from competition in our industrial composition to lack of business investment in new technology. I think Mike has done pretty compelling work that housing, in a lot of ways, is at the root of some of those productivity challenges. The reason why I lay it at the feet of the current government, besides something of rhetorical flourish, is I do think that the government came to office with a within its mind a new way of thinking about economic policy. That conventional thinking about economic policy tells us that there are trade-offs between equity and efficiency, and that a big part of the public policy process is to weigh those different trade-offs. And I think the Trudeau government, a lot of people around him, and I think a lot of progressives these days think that that type of thinking was wrong, or at least overstated. That that there are a whole host of equity-oriented policies, or what you might call sort of social policy, that actually don't involve trade-offs with economic efficiency or economic growth and so on. That they themselves can be growth-inducing. And well, there's something to that. In hindsight, the old orthodoxy was probably too rigid or dogmatic. I think the government has kind of overcorrected the other way, and it
How
started
so?
to
Can you give some examples?
yeah, it started to justify all sorts of social policy or redistributive spending, not in and of itself, not as an end in of itself, but they've gone further and tried to make the case that this represents an economic growth agenda. You hear this in a bunch of different areas, probably most notably in childcare, right, where the government doesn't seem satisfied to make the case that childcare is a social policy good, and that we ought to invest scarce public dollars in childcare, but that it itself is an economic policy. And I think that type of thinking, neglecting a focus on basic economic efficiency, is one of the factors that has led to this scenario where we are now seriously underperforming our competitors when it comes to GDP per capita.
So, Mike, I want to get your perspective on that, because I feel like you might
Well,
disagree.
I think there's a certain agreement. I don't, at some level though, I don't think it's a lack of trying in other areas. I mean, we recall that it seems like a lifetime ago, and perhaps it was, that the federal government did have an innovation agenda, and it was sort of looking at trying to increase productivity. I think one of the challenges we've had is that governments for the last 50 years have a bunch of innovation agendas, and we've tried everything. Successive governments have tried every approach to increase Canadian productivity in the last 50 years, and precisely none of it worked. 20 to 25 years ago, the orthodoxy was that if we just slash corporate taxes, that would get us there. Well, we did that, and didn't really, our productivity basically not only stayed flat, but we sort of started falling behind our OECD counterparts. And we've spent the last 50 years oscillating between two poles, where the first is that governments shouldn't be picking winners and losers, so let's just set an environment for business, and that will sort of create productivity. Let 1,000 flowers bloom type approach, and that really hasn't done much. And then you get to the other approach, where it's like, okay, well, we can't, the analogy you always hear in Ottawa is that we can't spread the peanut butter too thin. We have to make a few. I see Sean smiling. He's been in a lot of the same meetings I have. We weren't both in the same room at time to time, but still, you meet your finance officials, your industry officials, and so on, and you'll have someone say, oh, okay, well, we can't spread the peanut butter too thin. We have to make a few big bets, and at the end of it, you end up with a lentils supercluster, and that really hasn't accomplished much. So it does feel like we've thrown everything in the wall. But I would suggest that in at least the first, the 2015 to 2019 era, there were some policies there that were designed to increase productivity and increase innovation. I just don't think they've accomplished all that much. And I don't think Sean's entirely wrong either. That yeah, absolutely, the government views things like the child benefit system, like childcare, as not just social policy and economic policy. And there is some truth to it, but that those arguments can also be overstated.
Is that a bad thing? Should they be viewed purely from an economic perspective?
Well, I think they should be both. I think you can have both, and then maybe this is this is my showing my cards of exactly what Sean just said, of that progressives don't think there's much of a trade off there, and I'm kind of saying no, we can have both, which is implicitly taking that point of view. But I think there are really good arguments for increasing equity as an economic driver. And, oftentimes we see this from conservatives as well. So, Monty McNaughton, friend of ours who until recently was Ontario's labor minister. I mean, he's spent a lot of effort trying to get underrepresented groups into the skilled trades. And that would be an area where, it's inclusive policy, but it also solves a larger macroeconomic problem of like, we just don't have enough plumbers and electricians. So, why don't we, fish in a larger pond and be able to solve that problem?
I think the theory of case goes something like this, that there had been too much focus on economic efficiency, that it had come at the expense of equity. And in fact, there were a whole host of equity advancing priorities that the government had that they could plausibly argue had economic efficiency upside as well. And I agree that there, at times, the old orthodoxy probably overstated the tensions, but the disposition of the government, especially coming out of the pandemic, is clearly has a kind of set of preferences around social policy, and issues around equity and inclusion. And I think the risk, of course, is that comes at the expense of the basic stuff.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I should highlight that when I was doing economic advising, one of the things that the now prime minister would tell me is like don't try and be a political strategist. Just tell me the economics, and I'll figure it out. And maybe he'd get some advice from Jerry and Katie, but he wanted our view on the economics. But being in there, that there was a certain amount of orthodoxy breaking. I think the most obvious one was the need for balanced budgets. They made the bet in 2015 that like if you were stuck in your car, on the 403 or whatever, and heard a radio ad of the Liberals saying, "Hey, we will invest this money in infrastructure so you're not stuck in traffic." You would take that, and even if that meant going into deficit, you would take that bet. It's like, what do I care about more? Some line item on an income or balance sheet somewhere or an income statement somewhere, or do I not want to be stuck in traffic? So absolutely, I think there was a willingness to take a different approach, and there's a certain freedom, I suppose, of being the third place party with 3 dozen seats. So yeah, I certainly don't think Sean's entirely wrong that these folks were willing back in 2015 to make some risk and challenge some orthodoxy.
We want to find out whether the liberals and conservatives, if they have do they have an overlapping vision of what the middle class should look like? Like, is it a difference in the outcomes or just how to get there? So, Sean, what do you see as what the goals are for the Conservative Party right now for the middle class?
It's a good question. I mean, maybe just to stay on Mike's observations about the extent to which the Trudeau government had a self-image as challenging traditional economic and policymaking orthodoxy. What's interesting is Pierre Poilievre personifies in a lot of ways, at least rhetorically, a return to traditional economic orthodoxy. On another podcast recently, I was talking about fissures within conservative thinking across the Anglo-American world about what's sometimes stylized as freedom conservatism versus national conservatism. Some of that has, and some of those debates have played out a little bit in Canada. Aaron O'Toole clearly was nodding to a different kind of conceptualization of conservative orthodoxy. He nodded to ideas like solidarity. You may recall in his platform, he had ideas like mandating representation of workers on boards. He was kind of signaling that he thought there was a need to revisit some of those basic conservative economic orthodoxies, which really, found expression when Margaret Thatcher was elected in '79 and Ronald Reagan's elected in 1980. Pierre Poilievre has come down pretty firmly, at least again rhetorically, in favor of a pretty conventional view about markets, the role of government, um, and and so how that manifests itself in policy, is yet to be seen. But I think it involves, in a lot of ways, a return to pretty basic economic stuff. Moving certainly faster than the current government on balanced budgets. Deregulation, probably less tolerance for what you might call an industrial policy, or a more active role for state investment in different sectors.
What does that look like? What do you mean by that?
The Trudeau government has, in recent years, rolled out a series of policies where they see a role for the state to catalyze new technologies, or bet on certain high growth sectors or whatever. My sense is that Pierre would be resistant to those types of things. I'll stop rambling in a second. The one caveat to that is, of course, by opposing the carbon tax, he's put himself in a position where he's probably going to need to have a more kind of active role for the state in terms of clean technology, or new emissions reducing technologies. But I think that is an exception to the rule when it comes to how the Conservatives, at least under Pierre Poilievre, will kind of think and talk about the role of markets and the role of government.
Yeah, and that's really interesting because you mentioned these sort of two poles of conservatism. I kind of see that also kind of playing out in the center left, where there's a sort of active debate where on the one hand you have one that's more sort of focused on social policies and making the economic argument for those. So like you mentioned with childcare, but also having tuition grants to go to schools or whatever on that. But then you have this other school of thought that's mostly coming to the United States, but you see a little bit in Canada, what I call this supply side progressivism, where the role of government is to basically build a whole, figure out how to build a whole lot of infrastructure, either directly or indirectly, and that then sort of catalyzes inclusive growth. So having systems where it's easier for somebody to live in one community and work in another, and that sort of creates extra job opportunities and stuff. So vision that focuses more on things like high speed rail and all these sort of economic catalyzers. So it's interesting as well, and we've seen that play out a little bit. Like we saw Minister Freeland a couple times talk about supply side progressivism, and then essentially sort of dropped it. So we've seen the federal government kind of float these trial balloons, but not really ever go anywhere with them. But yeah, it's kind of interesting that perhaps some of the most interesting debates aren't between the left and right,
Yes.
but actually within the left and right.
Yes, agreed.
Talking about the supply side part of it, I know I've seen Chrystia Freeland talking about needing to build more homes, and that's something that I think is kind of a newer thing, where I hear them acknowledging that supply side and not the demand side is like the supply side is also as important as the demand side, and that seems kind of new. Why do you think they got to that point?
Well, I actually think that that's a perfect catalyst of this debate going on in the center left, because it used to be that the focus would be on the demand side, either shoo away the bad demand and then, have first time home buyer credits, or, programs for low income people, things like that, which, or even, rent vouchers, or something to help sort of lower income folks. Whereas now you've got this progressive YIMBY movement that's all about saying, okay, if we can figure out how to build more homes, downtown walkable neighborhoods, 15-minute cities and things like that's and that's good for both sort of economic growth and income and social mobility. So So yeah, that would be a debate where I do think we have seen a shift on the center left toward from more sort of demand side interventions and basically I would almost say saying no. Like let's say no to Airbnb, let's say no to the foreign investors, let's say no, 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 no to saying okay, actually maybe we still need to do those things, but what should we be doing that involves actually saying yes to some stuff and actually getting some stuff built?
Do you see any similar change, Sean, in the conservative side?
Yeah, yes. But if I may, I just want to stay on Mike's point because another area where you're starting to observe some similar debates occurring on the left and the right is on what I would describe as the question of state capacity. That there are for a whole host of reasons where old debates about government as a share of GDP or the size of government probably going to be less salient in the coming years. Because of aging demographics, because of climate change, because of evolving geopolitics, we're probably going to have a bigger government than more likely to have a bigger government than a smaller government. So then the question is less about how big it is and more about how effective it is. And this is something that ought to interest both progressives and conservatives. For progressives, it seems to me effective government is a key piece of the social license that they need to advance their values and priorities. For conservatives who are concerned about the cost and burden of government, making sure that the state is effective and efficient, ought to be a major priority. And I think we're starting to see the beginnings of that conversation being imported into Canada from elsewhere. Mike mentioned American influences when it comes to a new focus on the supply side. I think the same goes to the state capacity issue. Both Tyler Cowen, the George Mason University economist, has written about what he calls state capacity libertarianism. Ezra Klein, the progressive New York Times columnist, has written about state capacity as well. I think that's a piece of the puzzle that's missing a bit right now. A lot of the reasons we are in a world where we're having to think about incentives to try to catalyze building, not just housing, but all forms of supply, is because we've effectively created a kind of veto-ocracy when it comes to the approvals of housing, energy projects, and so on. I think that there is opportunity for bipartisan or multi-partisan progress when it comes to thinking about how do we make the state more effective and efficient so that it can discharge whatever responsibilities our politics ultimately ask of it.
What kinds of things do you think need to change now to make Canadians feel hopeful again?
Well, George Will, the dean of American conservative column writing, says the difference between 2% growth and 3% growth isn't 1%; it's 50%. And so, I do think that that the kind of economic stagnation that we've been facing, not just under the Trudeau years, but for basically the past 2 decades, is starting to kind of manifest itself in that pessimism about the future that I mentioned in the article that you were so kind to reference. I wouldn't underestimate, economic growth may not be a sufficient condition for that kind of improved kind of collective sense of the future, but I think it's a necessary one. And so to the extent to which the experiments on the part of the Trudeau government to tilt a bit more in the direction of equity probably needs some rebalancing in the name of economic efficiency and growth.
Yeah, and I think Sean hit on something really important when he spoke of state capacity, because nothing erodes belief in progressive programs than just stuff not working. I'm in Ottawa, and the general position or viewpoint people have on public transit because the LRT doesn't work has massive support, and that sort of erodes erodes public support for it. And progressives will get into this thinking of, well, it's not this was a a shady triple P, and we got screwed by the private sector partner. I'm like, okay, yeah, but all that's true, but nobody cares, right? Like, what they care about is the fact that they can't pick their kid up from daycare because the subway's not moving. So I absolutely think that is a big issue for progressive at all three levels. Or how can we get not only Canadians to feel better about themselves and the progress, but also how can we get them believing in the value of these programs? Stuff just needs to work, and we're seeing that issue. We have been 40 or sorry we have been about 15 years away from high speed rail for the last 40 years. It's just kind of all of this stuff, and it just makes it hard for people to believe in these things. And one final example is all the 23-year-olds I talk to, largely, like, they don't believe in social housing as a solution, and it's not because they don't think it's a good idea. It's just that we haven't built any in so long they can't conceptualize it, right? So I think there really does need to be a focus on state capacity and just delivering what you promised to deliver.
When it comes to the GDP per person, what I've read is that as you increase immigration without matching it with housing, that's what causes the decrease in per person GDP. And so I was just wondering, Sean, what you think about, I guess, the immigration numbers that we have right now in our target.
First of all, I think that immigration is important for the country. I often say that Canada's achieved something few other jurisdictions have, which is relatively high levels of public support for relatively high levels of immigration, which of course is a good thing. But there are a lot of voices out there who see immigration as an essential solution to the fact that, to the challenge that Mike cited at the very beginning, which is we haven't quite figured out how to grow our economy and raise productivity in spite of all of the things that we've been trying. And I think there are some people who say, well, fine, then the way to do it is just to increase immigration, and that necessarily increases economic growth. I think that's the wrong way to think about it. The second thing I'd say is that we need to make sure that immigration policy, this comes back to the state capacity conversation, like the way immigration targets are essentially set these days is the federal minister of immigration announces once a year what his or her targets. And then essentially it's up to provinces and municipalities to figure out how we're going to successfully integrate and settle those people into our society. And it needs to be a much more bottom-up process. We need to make sure that we have the basic infrastructure in place. And I would just say, before I turn over to Mike, that what I'm saying is not impossible to envision actually being carried out. I mean, the minister doesn't need to consult every mayor in the country, right? The vast majority of immigrants settle in a small number of places. So there ought to be some two-way conversation between those cities who are on the front lines of immigration settlement and the federal immigration minister, so that whatever the target is a number that we can that we have confidence that we can successfully integrate. And I think one of the challenges with that we've seen in past several months is that the absence of that two-way conversation is harming our ability to integrate. And what worries me the most, of course, is then starts to create doubts in the minds of Canadians about immigration and risks undermining that comparative advantage that I mentioned at the outset.
And Mike?
Yeah, I totally agree. I thought Sean and I were supposed to disagree more. It's I do think, just as an aside, I think the more you spend time in the Ottawa bubble, even if you're wearing different uniforms, the closer you kind of start to see other points of view. But yeah, it's, to my mind, it's completely bonkers that in a strong language, it's completely bananas that the immigration minister in November says, oh, by the way, here's what the target's going to be for next year. as if we can build enough houses and schools and roads and things like that to deal with that. So in my view, it's never been about the number. And in particularly, we have a whole episode about this, that, the really interesting stuff's happening on the non-permanent international student number. It's just a lack of planning, right? If in 2015 the federal government had said, okay, you know what, the immigration number in 2025 is going to be 500,000, and we would have a million international students. And then over time, that both government, all three orders of government, the private sector, and so on, we could kind of ramp up and plan to that. But that's not how we do things, and it's a huge problem. So what I would love to see is the federal government, first of all, absolutely work with the 6 or 7 mayors who, end up, having the majority of newcomers, but also come up with 5 or 10-year targets and plans to give everybody time to adjust. And yes, there's political risk, and yes, we don't know who the prime minister will be every 2 years from now, but that's essentially how we set policy, right? Is that we should come up with long-term plans, understand that regime changes happen and those plans may change, but at least it gives some level of certainty. Because how we do things right now involves absolutely no planning whatsoever, and we find ourselves in situations like this. And I agree with Sean that I think the biggest risk here is that we undermine the public support for immigration, and this turns us, and we turn down a very dark road that we don't have to, just because of a lack of planning.
Okay, well, speaking of planning, we're planning to end the segment here, and we'll hopefully get into more of this at another time, because I think this, you guys have brought up so many different parts of the conversation that deserve so much more time, and we'll definitely want to get there. Well, thank you so much, Sean, for joining us today, and I want to thank our producer, Meredith Martin, and to everyone watching and listening. So don't forget to subscribe so you can catch all of our new episodes as soon as they're out. Thank you very much, and until next time.